Listen to me with the depth of your spirit, not with the surface of your ears. Because what I am about to say will shake what you thought you understood. And it will awaken something God has been trying to stir inside you for a long time. You have heard the phrase, speaking in tongues. And your mind immediately formed pictures, sounds, assumptions, and even fear. But God told me it is not what you think. And the misunderstanding has kept many powerful believers weak, silent, and disconnected from the deepest flow of divine power. I want you to understand this with clarity, not emotion alone. God never releases power without purpose. And God never gives a gift without intention. What people call speaking in tongues has been wrapped in noise, confusion, imitation, and human pride. But God is not the author of confusion. When God speaks, He speaks to awaken, to align, to activate. Many have tried to imitate the sound without ever touching the source. And God said to me, they learned the echo but never entered the chamber. That is why so many speak yet remain doctor. Shout yet remain weak. Pray yet remain unchanged. Hear me carefully. God is not interested in strange sounds. God is interested in surrendered hearts. When the human language reaches its limit, when the mind cannot articulate the burden, when pain is too deep, joy too overwhelming, vision too large, God gives a language that bypasses human limitation. It is not for performance. It is not for public display. It is not for spiritual competition. It is the language of intimacy, the groaning of a soul aligning with divine will when words fail and logic collapses. Many people think speaking in tongues is about sound, but God told me it is about posture. It is the posture of total dependence. When a person reaches the point where pride dissolves, where control is surrendered, where self-expression is laid down, something supernatural happens. God begins to speak through the yielded vessel, not because the person is special, but because God honors surrender more than talent. Power does not come from noise. Power comes from obedience. I have seen people chase experiences while ignoring transformation. God does not want you to chase manifestations. He wants you to become a habitation. When the soul becomes a dwelling place for God's presence, the overflow may sound unfamiliar, but the root is always humility. The mistake of this generation is trying to sound spiritual without becoming spiritual. God said, I am not impressed by volume, I am moved by surrender. Let me speak to those who have felt inferior because they did not sound like others. God never asked you to copy her person's expression. God created you with a unique spiritual frequency. When God speaks through you, it will carry His signature, not another person's accent. Comparison kills revelation. Many have silenced themselves because they tried to measure their experience against another's display. God says your authenticity matters more than imitation. Speaking in tongues, as God revealed, is the soul. All praying when the mind steps aside. It is the spirit breathing when the intellect is exhausted. It is not madness, it is not chaos, it is alignment. When God communicates beyond vocabulary, He is not bypassing intelligence, He is healing it. There are wounds logic cannot reach. There are burdens language cannot carry. God's language reaches where human speech collapses. Some of you have been TR, needing to pray your way out of pain, but your pain has no words. God understands the language of tears. God understands the language of silence. And God understands the language that rises from the depths when the soul surrenders control. That is why this is not learned by instruction, it is released by trust. You cannot manufacture it. You cannot force it. You must yield to God. I want to speak why authority now. Stop chasing the sound and start chasing the surrender. The sound will follow. Many people are loud but empty. God is looking for those who are quiet enough to hear Him and broken enough to carry Him. When God fills a person, overflow is inevitable. Overflow is not the goal, it is the result. God told me that many are afraid of losing control, and that fear has kept them locked in shallow spirituality. True power begins where control ends. As long as you must understand everything, you will never experience everything. Faith is not about explanation, it is about trust. When God leads you beyond understanding, He is not confusing you, He is expanding you. This language God gives is not meant to impress people. It is meant to build the inner man. It strengthens where discouragement weakened you. It aligns where fear distorted you. It energizes where exhaustion drained you. People ask why they still feel empty after praying with words. It is because words can be filtered by fear, doubt, and habit. But when God prays through you, there is no interference. Hear this truth deeply. God does not give this to elevate you above others. He gives it to bring you deeper in. Owe Him. Pride contaminates power. Humility attracts presence. When people turn this into a badge of superiority, they lose its essence. God withdraws where arrogance takes over. This is sacred, not sensational. I speak now to those who were wounded by misuse, manipulation, or pressure. God never forces intimacy. God invites. If you were pushed, shamed, or made to feel less, that was not God. Gentle, yet powerful. Quiet, yet overwhelming. When God moves, fear leaves, confusion leaves, pressure leaves, peace remains. Let me say this clearly. Speaking in tongues is not proof of spirituality. Love is, obedience is, character is. God would rather have a silent servant than a noisy rebel. If the language does not produce humility, it is counterfeit. If it does not produce compassion, it is empty. If it does not produce holiness, it is noise. God told me to say this. Many people are praying for change while resisting transformation. The language God gives works on the inside before it ever manifests on the outside. It rearranges priorities. It exposes hidden motives. It strengthens discipline. If you only want power without purity, God will withhold the key. There is a generation rising that will understand this correctly. They will not shout to be seen. They will pray to be aligned. They will not copy sounds. They will cultivate surrender. They will not seek platforms. They will seek presence. And God will trust them with power because they will not abuse it. Some of you feel spiritually dry because you have been praying from memory instead of from hunger. God responds to hunger. When you come to God empty, He fills you. When you come full of yourself, He waits. The deepest expressions of prayer are born in desperation, not routine. God is restoring purity to this gift. He is removing the circus and restoring the sanctuary. He is stripping away performance and restoring intimacy. What God is about to do will not be loud at first. It will be deep. It will not draw attention. It will draw alignment. I feel compelled to say this with gravity. Do not mock what you do not understand. Many dismiss what they have never surrendered to. God does not force revelation on the proud. Revelation bows before humility. If you come with a teachable heart, God will guide you gently. This language is not for public validation. It is for private transformation. When you lock yourself away with God, when you lay down titles, roles, and expectations, when you stop trying to sound right and start trying to be right, God meets you there. And when He meets you, something flows that words cannot contain. God said to me, tell them this is not about the mouth, it is about the heart. The mouth is only the instrument. The heart is the altar. When the altar is clean, the fire falls. When the altar is polluted, the fire withholds. God responds to purity. I want you to understand the urgency. This is not optional for those who want depth. You can survive without it, but you cannot thrive in intimacy without surrender. God is calling people beyond surface faith into deep alignment. The days of shallow spirituality are ending. If you have been afraid Release that fear. Fear does not come from God. If you have been confused, seek clarity in God's presence, not in people's opinions. If you have been curious, pursue God, not experiences. God is the source, not the manifestation. Let me speak prophetically now. God is raising people who will pray beyond emotion, beyond language, age, beyond limitation. Their inner life will be strong even when the outer world shakes. They will not panic in crisis because their roots are deep. This language strengthens roots. Some of you have been fighting battles you were never meant to fight with human strength. God gives divine assistance when human effort ends. When you surrender your inability, God releases His ability. That is where this language flows most freely. I will say it again with authority. Speaking in tongues is not what you think. It is not a badge. It is not a show. It is not a requirement for acceptance. It is a gift of intimacy, a channel of alignment, a weapon of surrender. When God prays through you, heaven and earth align. When God prays through you, confusion dissolves. When God prays through you, strength returns. Not because you understand it, but because God understands you. Stay still long enough for God to lead you there. Stop striving, stop imitating, stop performing. Lay yourself before God with nothing to prove. When you reach the end of yourself, God begins. And I sense God saying that many who thought they were excluded will be the ones most deeply filled, because they come without day, without assumption, without entitlement, only hunger, only surrender, only faith. And God never rejects a surrendered heart. God never ignores hunger. God never withholds Himself from those who come empty and willing. And in that quiet place where expectations fall away and the soul finally bows, God breathes, God fills, God aligns, God speaks beyond words, beyond thought, beyond sound, into tea. He deepest chambers of the heart, where transformation begins and continues and deepens and flows and strengthens and settles and anchors and awakens and carries and sustains and builds and reshapes and renews and establishes and aligns and keeps moving and drawing and filling and guiding and unfolding and working and speaking and dwelling and reigning and revealing and calling and empowering and rounding and lifting and shaping and sealing and anchoring and filling again and again and again. There is a dimension of prayer where the soul stops explaining itself and starts trusting God completely. And this is where many hesitate, because explanation feels safer than surrender. God told me that people cling to understanding as if it were a shield, but understanding can become a prison when it are. It places trust. When you insist on interpreting every movement of God through logic, you reduce the infinite to the manageable, and God refuses to be managed. He invites you into mystery not to confuse you, but to mature you. Mystery stretches faith, and faith is the atmosphere where divine power moves freely. God is calling people out of noisy religion into quiet authority. Authority does not show. To prove itself, it stands firm because it knows where it comes from. The deepest spiritual strength is often unseen, cultivated in moments when no one is watching, when there is no applause, no audience, no pressure to perform. In those moments when the soul opens itself fully to God, something begins to flow that does not need permission from the mind. It is not disorder, it is divine order. Working beneath the surface, many misunderstand because they look for outward evidence before inward alignment. God always works from the inside out. He restores the foundation before He rebuilds the structure. When God gives a language beyond human speech, He is not bypassing wisdom. He is planting it deeper than words can reach. He is teaching the soul to rely on Him instead of self-expression. That reliance produces stability, not chaos. It produces clarity, not confusion. God told me to speak to those who feel spiritually fatigued. You are not tired because you lack effort. You are tired because you have been carrying burdens meant for God alone. Human language can carry information, but it cannot always carry surrender. When God allows the soul to pray beyond words, it is because He is lifting weights you were never meant to hold. That is why peace follows true surrender. That is why strength returns without explanation. Some have reduced this sacred flow to a ritual, repeating sounds without reverence, and God is correcting that now. God does not respond to habit, He responds to hunger. When prayer becomes routine, its power diminishes. When prayer becomes desperate, depende. Evan responds. God listens not to the eloquence of speech, but to the posture of the heart. A broken whisper carries more power than a confident shout when that whisper is surrendered. I want to reveal something God impressed deeply upon me. The language He gives is not always audible. Sometimes it is a stirring, sometimes a groaning, sometimes a silence so heavy with presence that words woe. Old only disturb it. Do not limit God to sound. God speaks in ways that transcend the mouth. When the soul aligns with Him fully, communication happens at a level deeper than vocabulary. There are moments when God leads you into stillness, and stillness itself becomes prayer. In those moments, your spirit is speaking even when your mouth is quiet. Many miss this because they expect God to move automatically, but God often moves deeply before He moves visibly. Depth always precedes impact. Those who rush the process remain shallow, but those who linger with God are transformed. God is also addressing fear. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of appearing foolish. Fear of losing control. Fear has no authority in the presence of God. When fear governs your response to God, intimacy suffers. God does not humiliate those who surrender to Him, He strengthens them. The enemy of the soul uses ridicule to silence what God wants to awaken. Do not let fear interpret what only surrender can understand. There is a sacred privacy to this flow of prayer. God does not expose what is meant to be protected. When people display intimacy meant for the secret place, power drains. God values the hiddenly because what is hidden grows roots. What is constantly displayed dries out. Protect what God is cultivating within you. Not every experience needs an audience. God is teaching His people to distinguish between emotion and encounter. Emotion can be stirred by atmosphere, music, or expectation. Encounter changes direction, discipline, and desire. If what you experience does not lead you into per obedience, it was not encounter. God's presence always leaves evidence in character. The language He gives will shape how you live, not just how you pray. Some of you are waiting for permission to go deeper, but God is waiting for surrender. He has already extended the invitation. The door is not locked, it is opened by humility. When you lay down the need to be right, the need to be seen, you need to be validated, God meets you there. And when He meets you, He reshapes you from the inside out. God told me that many are trying to fix their lives by adjusting behavior, while God wants to transform identity. Behavior modification exhausts the soul. Identity transformation empowers it. When the soul is aligned with God, obedience becomes natural, not forced. The language of surrender. Ours naturally from a heart that trusts God completely. I sense God calling people into consistency, not intensity. Intense moments without consistent surrender produce instability. But steady, humble alignment produces lasting strength. God is not looking for occasional passion. He is looking for daily dependence. When dependence becomes a lifestyle, prayer deepens beyond words. There is also a warning God impressed upon me. Do not judge others by your own experience. God leads each soul uniquely. Some will express outwardly, some inwardly, but God measures faithfulness, not form. When people argue over expression, they reveal insecurity. Secure souls rest in God's guidance without comparison. God is raising people who will carry quiet authority into chaotic spaces. They will not panic because their inner life is anchored. They will not be shaken because their prayer life is deep. They will speak wisdom when others speak noise. This strength is forged in surrender, not in display. If you desire this depth, come to God honestly. Do not pretend, do not perform, do not force. Sit before Him and admit your weakness. God responds to truth. When you stop hiding, He starts filling. And you stop striving, He starts flowing. This is not learned in a crowd, it is received in surrender. God never withholds Himself from those who seek Him sincerely. He does not tease the hungry or ignore the humble. When you come with an open heart, He meets you according to His wisdom, not your expectation. Trust His timing, trust His method, trust His heart. This is a call to maturity, not speed. Sitako, a call to depth, not drama. A call to surrender, not noise. God is refining His people, drawing them inward so they can stand outwardly with strength. What He is doing now will not impress the shallow, but it will sustain the faithful. Remain open, remain humble, remain hungry. Let God define the experience, not tradition, not fear, not imitation. When God leads, follow without resistance. When He invites you deeper, do not hesitate. The deepest work God does often happens where words end and trust begins, where the soul rests in Him without explanation, without control, without fear, allowing God to move, to speak, to shape, to strengthen, to align, to fill, to guide, to establish, to renew, to deepen, to awaken, to steady, to carry, to anchor, to empower, to dwell, to reign, to reveal, to transform, to sustain, to continue unfolding beyond what the mind can grasp and the mouth can express. As the heart yields again and again and again, there is also a responsibility that comes with deeper prayer. And God does not give depth without demanding alignment. When the soul is strengthened inwardly, the life must follow outwardly. God is not interested in hidden power paired with public compromise. What He builds in secret must be reflected in conduct, integrity, and justice. True spiritual depth sharpens conscience, not dulls it. If a person claims intimacy with God but walks carelessly with truth, something is misaligned. God's presence refines before it reassures. God is teaching His people that the greatest spiritual breakthroughs often come through discipline, not impulse. Many wait for a feeling to pray, but God honors commitment more than emotion. When you return to Him consistently, even when nothing feels dramatic, something is being fortified inside you. The language of surrender deepens through perseverance. Faith grows muscles when it shows up without applause. God sees what is built quietly and trusts those who are faithful without reward. There is a clarity that comes when the inner life is aligned with God. Decisions become sharper, discernment becomes stronger. You begin to recognize what drains your spirit and what nourishes it. God uses deep prayer to recalibrate desire. Things that once distracted, you lose their power. Things that once seemed small become sacred. This is not because the world changes, but because your inner compass has been realigned. God also corrects motives in this place. Many want spiritual depth for personal gain, influence, or escape, but God redirects the heart towards service. True intimacy with God always expands compassion. It makes you sensitive to injustice, to suffering, to the weight others carry. If prayer does not soften the heart toward people, it has missed its purpose. God's presence never isolates. 8, it equips you to love wisely and act courageously. There are seasons when God seems silent, and many interpret silence as absence. But silence is often instruction. In those moments, God is teaching trust beyond sensation. The soul learns to rest without constant reassurance. This is maturity. Children need constant affirmation. Mature faith stands even when the voice is quiet. God is not testing abandonment. He is building endurance. God told me that some are frustrated because they want instant depth. But depth requires time. Roots do not grow overnight. When you stay planted, when you resist the urge to rush, God establishes something unshakable. Those who hurry remain fragile. Those who wait become strong. Waiting is not inactivity, it is agreement with God's process. There is also a communal responsibility. God never intended spiritual depth to produce isolation or superiority. When the inner life is healthy, it contributes to unity, wisdom, and peace among people. God resists prideful spirituality. He honors those who carry depth with gentleness. Authority expressed without humility becomes destructive. God entrusts influence to those who will steward it carefully. Some of you are navigating suffering, and you wonder where this depth fits into pain. God does not remove all suffering, but He gives strength to endure it. In moments when grief has no language, when loss has no explanation, God meets the soul beyond words. This is where prayer becomes survival. Not dramatic, not loud, but steady, anchoring, sustaining. God does not waste pain, He transforms it. Into your depth. God is also correcting the idea that spirituality is disconnected from daily responsibility. True prayer sharpens diligence, honesty, patience, and responsibility. If your inner life grows but your work ethic weakens, something is wrong. God empowers people to live well, not to escape life. Depth with God makes you more present, not less. I feel compelled to speak to those who feel overlooked. God does His deepest work in unseen places. History is shaped by people whose names are never celebrated, but whose faithfulness sustains generations. God sees what others ignore. He records what the world forgets. When you choose surrender over recognition, God builds something eternal. There is also joy in this depth that does not depend on circumstance. It is quiet but steady. It does not fluctuate wildly. It anchors you when everything else shakes. This joy is not excitement, it is assurance. It comes from knowing God is near, involved, attentive. When the soul rests in that truth, fear loses its grip. God is inviting people to stop arguing about expressions and start pursuing transformation. Arguments drain energy that surrender would multiply. God does not reveal Himself to win debates. He reveals Himself to shape lives. When people prioritize being right over being aligned, they miss the invitation entirely. If you are listening and sensing resistance within you, do not fight it with effort. Bring it to God honestly. Resistance often reveals areas where control still dominates. God does not shame resistance, He invites surrender. When you acknowledge your hesitatio, God meets you there with patience and wisdom. This depth also teaches restraint. Not everything needs to be said. Not every insight needs to be shared. God trusts those who know when to speak and when to be silent. Wisdom is knowing the difference. Silence guided by God carries more authority than words spoken without discernment. God is forming people who will stand steady in unstable times. When confusion spreads, they will remain clear. When fear escalates, they will remain grounded. This steadiness is not natural. It is cultivated through surrender. When the inner life is aligned, the outer life follows. If you desire this, do not wait for permission or validation. Begin where you are. Offer God honesty instead of performance. Offer consistency instead of intensity. Offer humility instead of certainty. God responds to the posture of the heart, not the perfection of expression. He is drawing people beyond the surface, beyond noise, beyond imitation, into a life anchored in trust, shaped by obedience, strengthened by quiet surrender, where prayer is not an event, but a posture, where communication with God flows from alignment rather than effort, where the soul learns to rest deeply in Him, even when circumstances remain unresolved, even when answers are delayed, even when the path ahead is unclear. Continuing to walk, to trust, to yield, to listen, to align, to deepen, to remain, to be shaped, to be strengthened, to be guided, to be established as God continues His work beneath the surface, where lasting transformation is formed and sustained and carried forward into every unseen moment. There is another layer God is unveiling, and it is the discipline of listening. Any want to speak to God, but few want to be still long enough to hear Him. The deeper the prayer, the quieter the soul becomes. God does not compete with noise. When you silence distractions, ambitions, and internal arguments, clarity begins to rise. Listening is not passive. It is an act of trust. You are declaring that God's wisdom outweighs your urgency. God told me that many prayers fail not because they lack passion, but because they lack alignment. Alignment happens when the soul stops insisting and starts agreeing. Agreement with God does not always mean understanding the outcome. It means trusting the direction. When prayer moves beyond words, the soul begins to align with divine intention rather than personal desire. That alignment produces peace even before circumstances change. There is also a refining fire that accompanies deeper surrender. God does not deepen you without purifying you. He exposes habits, attitudes, and attachments that weaken spiritual sensitivity. This is not punishment, it is preparation. God removes what limits you so He can entrust you with more. Resistance to refinement delays growth. Acceptance accelerates transformation. God is addressing impatience. Impatience rushes prayer and shortens depth. God operates outside human urgency. What feels slow to you is often precise to Him. When you learn to move at God's pace, frustration loses power. Patience is not waiting idly, it is waiting expectantly, confident that God is working even when you cannot trace the movement. There is a sacred courage required to go deeper, courage to face yourself honestly, courage to release familiar patterns, courage to trust God beyond comfort. Many avoid depth because depth requires confrontation with inner realities. But God does not expose to condemn, He reveals to heal. What you bring into His presence loses its power to control you. God also teaches discernment through this surrendered prayer. You begin to sense timing, direction, and restraint. You learn when to move and when to wait. Impulsive decisions decrease because inner clarity increases. Discernment is not suspicion, it is sensitivity to God's guidance. That sensitivity grows in quiet surrender. I sense God speaking to those who feel unqualified. God has never depended on qualification. He depends on availability. When you offer yourself sincerely, God supplies what you lack, strengthens where you are weak. He teaches where you are unsure. The depth of prayer is not reserved for the gifted. It is accessible to the surrendered. There is also healing in this place that does not require revisiting every wound. God heals many things by realignment rather than analysis. When the soul aligns with Him, what was fractured begins to settle. Peace enters without explanation. Strength returns without effort. Healing does not always announce itself. It often unfolds quietly. God is dismantling the idea that spiritual depth must always feel intense. Some seasons are gentle, some are steady, some are silent, all are purposeful. When you learn to value consistency over excitement, your faith becomes resilient. God is more interested in endurance than sensation. This Soren. Third, prayer also sharpens accountability. You become more aware of your words, choices, and influence. God entrusts depth to those who will steward it responsibly. Influence without integrity damages both the carrier and those affected. God protects His work by shaping the character of those He deepens. God told me that many underestimate the power of small, faithful moments. A few quiet minutes. Surrender daily can transform a life over time. Depth is cumulative. What you cultivate consistently becomes your foundation. When storms come, foundations matter more than appearances. There is also a prophetic awareness that grows in this depth. Not prediction, but perception. You begin to see beyond surface reactions into underlying realities. You respond with wisdom instead of impulse. This awareness is not dramatic. It is practical. It guides decisions, conversations, and priorities. God is inviting people to stop compartmentalizing faith. Depth with God is not limited to prayer moments. It shapes how you work, speak, listen, and rest. When God becomes the center, everything aligns around Him. Life simplifies because priorities become clear. If you feel stretched by this message, that stretching is intentional. Growth always feels uncomfortable before it feels empowering. God stretches capacity before He fills it. Do not retreat from the tension, remain open within it. God is enlarging you. There is also rest here, not rest from responsibility, but rest from striving. Striving is the attempt to control outcomes. Surrender releases control to God. When you rest in Him, EFFO, RT becomes focused rather than frantic. Peace becomes stable rather than temporary. God is preparing people who will carry weight without collapsing, who will influence without corruption, who will lead without pride. This preparation happens in hidden alignment. What is forged privately sustains publicly. God never rushes preparation. If you have felt stalled, it may be because God is deepening. Roost before expanding reach. Expansion without depth collapses under pressure. Depth without recognition remains strong. God chooses strength over speed every time. Stay attentive, stay humble, stay yielded. Let God define prayer, depth, and direction. Release assumptions, release fear, release the need to control the process. God is faithful to complete what He begins in a surrendered heart company. Continuing to shape, refine, strengthen, and align the inner life so that everything flowing outward carries stability, clarity, wisdom, endurance, and quiet authority as the journey of surrender deepens further and further into trust, obedience, and lasting transformation. God is also restoring reverence, because depth without reverence becomes casual, and casual familiarity drains awe. Awe keeps that heart tender. Awe keeps the spirit alert. When awe fades, discipline weakens. God is not distant, but He is holy, and holiness invites careful surrender. When you approach God with reverence, you listen differently, you respond differently, you live differently. Reverence anchors intimacy, so it does not decay into entitlement. There is a maturity God is forming, where prayer is no longer driven by urgency alone, but by alignment. Many pray only when pressure arrives, but God is teaching constancy beyond crisis. When prayer becomes a rhythm rather than a reaction, stability is born. Crisis-driven prayer seeks relief. Alignment-driven prayer seeks agreement. Agreement reshapes the future before emergencies arise. God told me that some people struggle because they treat prayer as an escape rather than an engagement. God does not draw you inward to detach you from reality, but to empower you within it. True depth increases responsibility. When you walk closely with God, you become accountable for what you sense, for what you discern, for how you respond. Revelation carries obligation. There is also a refining of speech that follows deep surrender. When the inner language changes, language follows. Words become fewer but weightier. Complaints diminish. Gratitude deepens. You become careful not to speak what contradicts what God is building inside you. Alignment trains the tongue before it empowers the voice. God is dismantling spiritual impatience that demands immediate clarity. Some directions unfold step by step. God reveals enough light for obedience, not enough to eliminate trust. When you obey the light you have, more light comes. Disobedience delays clarity. Obedience unlocks it. There is also a strengthening of conscience in this depth. You begin to sense conviction gently but firmly. God does not shout correction. He whispers it to the attentive. When you ignore those whispers, sensitivity dulls. When you honor them, discernment sharpens. Sensitivity to God's guidance is a treasure that must be protected. God is inviting people to release the fear of being ordinary. Many chase extraordinary experiences while neglecting faithful obedience. God often hides greatness inside ordinary faithfulness. When you serve quietly, forgive consistently, and obey daily, you build a life God can trust. Extraordinary impact grows from ordinary surrender. This depth also reframes success. Success becomes faithfulness rather than visibility, obedience rather than outcome, alignment rather than applause. When success is redefined, anxiety loses power. You stop measuring your life by comparison and start measuring it by obedience. God is also exposing spiritual shortcuts. There are no shortcuts to depth. Anything that promises instant maturity bypasses formation. God shapes slowly so the soul can sustain what it carries. Rushed depth fractures under pressure. Formed depth remains steady. I sense God speaking to those who feel disoriented. Diso. Reorientation often precedes realignment. When familiar structures fall away, God is creating space for deeper roots. Do not panic when old methods no longer satisfy. It is a sign of growth, not loss. God is inviting you beyond what once worked into what will now sustain. There is also a call to courage in obedience. Some directions from God require unpopular decisions. Depth with God will sometimes separate you from crowds, but never from purpose. When you obey God over opinion, peace follows, even if affirmation does not. God is teaching people to recognize His guidance, not through pressure, but through peace. Peace does not mean absence of challenge. It means presence of assurance. When the soul is aligned, even difficult steps carry calm confidence. Chaos signals misalignment. Peace signals agreement. This surrendered life also develops endurance. You learn to persist without constant reward. Faithfulness becomes its own strength. Endurance is built when you remain aligned, even when nothing seems to change. God works deeply in seasons that appear unproductive. God told me that many underestimate how much He values trust. Trust moves God's heart more than perfection. When you trust Him with your weakness, He supplies strength. When you trust Him with your future, He supplies direction. Trust opens doors effort cannot. There is also a cleansing of desire that happens here. God reorders what you want. Some desires fade, others sharpen. When desire aligns with God's will, pursuit becomes focused rather than scattered. Life simplifies because longing becomes clear. God is preparing people who will not collapse under delay. Delay exposes motivation. Those driven by validation quit. Those driven by obedience remain. Remaining builds capacity. Capacity invites entrustment. If you feel God calling you deeper, respond without bargaining. Do not negotiate surrender. Partial surrender produces partial peace. Full surrender produces rest. God never demands surrender to take from you. He invites it to give to you. This is a season of deep formation. God is not impressed by speed. He is committed to stability. What He is building now will sustain you later. Remain yielded, remain attentive, remain faithful in small things. Depth grows quietly, steadily, intentionally, as God continues shaping hearts that are willing to trust Him beyond explanation, to obey Him beyond comfort, and to walk with Him beyond serve. Ace faith into a life anchored in reverence, discipline, courage, and enduring alignment that carries strength into every season and steadiness into every unknown step. Now I ask you to pause, not just in sound, but in spirit, and examine where you have been living from habit instead of hunger, from routine instead of reverence, from control instead of trust. God is not asking for perfection, He is asking for honesty. Lay down the masks you have worn, the strength you pretended to have, the explanations you used to avoid surrender. God does not meet people where they perform, He meets them where they yield. Let this be the moment you stop negotiating depth and start embracing alignment. God is closer than you think, more attentive than you imagine, and more committed to your transformation than you have ever been to your comfort. Open your inner life to Him fully. Do not hold back rooms of fear, regret, or ambition. What you hide cannot be healed. What you surrender cannot remain the same. Choose today to cultivate a life anchored in quiet obedience rather than loud display. Choose to value what God is doing within you more than what others see around you. When you walk with God sincerely, your life becomes a living testimony without effort, without noise, without striving. Depth speaks for itself. Let the language of surrender reshape how you pray, how you decide, how you endure, how you love, how you stand when others fall. Let your inner alignment become your greatest strength. God is calling you beyond surface faith into rooted trust, beyond borrowed conviction into personal surrender, beyond fear-driven religion into steady devotion. Stand up inwardly and respond. Draw closer, yield deeper, trust fully. God is faithful to those who come honestly, and He never wastes a surrendered life. Walk forward with reverence, courage, and unwavering trust, knowing that when you give God your whole heart, He gives you strength, peace, clarity, and a depth that cannot be shaken.